The wide shot, close up, the medium shot. Many of the choices the film editor makes every time they put a scene together. It's all coming up next on Below the Line.
It's Below the Line with George Peroulas. On tonight's show,
from cross-country driving to non-linear editing, my guest today has seen and done a lot. Please welcome editor Tim Vogel. How are you, Tim?
I'm great, George. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. Now, tell me, what were you doing driving all over the country?
I was a show car driver for Roger Penske, and basically would take Rick Mears IndyCar all over the country, doing shows, go to the racetrack, do whatever I needed to do. And when I was off the road, I was back at the office editing video proposals and corporate video presentations for Penske Racing and their sponsors.
Now you're working in entertainment full-time, but you began in radio years ago.
Yep, years ago. It was 1976. I take that back. It was 1972. I was 13 years old. My grandfather had this great set of pipes and just kind of inspired me to get into radio and, you know, follow your dream. And so I just started knocking on the radio station door, and they finally let me in and let me play with some of the equipment when they were off the air, and rip wire and practice reading the news stories that came over the old hammer mill teletype machines. That was pretty cool stuff, you know, for a 13-year-old to do.
And over the years, you did more radio and then got into web development, music videos, open-air cinema, and eventually your racing connections brought you to Mooresville, North Carolina.
Right.
And then you're working with Time Warner Cable, editing lots of things there, over 3,000 commercials. Is that when you decided that editing would be your full-time passion?
Yeah, I think editing came out of the radio experience, because I spent 18 years in radio, worked over at 2 different 50,000-watt radio stations in upstate New York. There's a lot of editing, cutting and splicing of tape, and you know, digital was not even a thought back then in those days. I got out of radio basically in 86, 87, around 88 actually. 1988 is when I got out of radio. And it's all part of it. It's all encompassing, because I was also doing video in high school, video camera operating, and running the first color camera in like 4 counties in upstate New York. So it's all part of it. It's always been in my blood, I guess.
And what does a film editor do? What are the basic job descriptions of editing a feature film?
Wow, it can be varied from project to project. I just recently finished a project where I was the assistant editor, I was the data wrangler, and the main lead editor. So I had my hands on that project from the second the footage comes out of the camera, digital compact flashcards, to my edit station, which for the first 2 weeks of the feature film shoot was actually on set. So what they shot in the morning, I would have rough cut by the end of that day, and by noon the next day, I'd have the previous afternoon's scenes rough cut as well. So I was always like a half a day behind the company. So I was doing the logging of the footage, making sure the cards were properly formatted to go back to the camera department. Then I would triple back up the files in raw form, and then I would start cutting what we have as known as the dailies. So the director and the producer can come in and see what they shot. Did we get all the coverage that we need? Did we need to do ADR? Because that's something, automatic dialogue replacement or additional dialogue replacement. Those things need to be determined in the assistant editor stage. So do we need to do pickups? Do we need to reshoot something? So at that point, then I'll move it into what we call a coverage cut stage, which is basically I call it a rough cut, where I will edit what I think to be the scene. And we start with the wides, go to maybe some 2 shots, or maybe some close-ups, get some reactions, give the director all the coverage that was shot in that particular scene. Whether we're going to use it or not is irrelevant. They want to know if they got all the coverage that they needed from the talent. And then from there, we go into the final, once that's all done with the whole film, then we go into post-production. And that's where the final edit actually starts taking place, and that's when we start tweaking the film.
And speaking of the final edit, what happens in post-production, the specifics when you're actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of getting the final scenes edited?
Well, a lot of the times, like this last feature that I just came off of, I was given pretty much free license to trim the fat. When I do the rough cut, I leave handles on either side of a particular take, so we know we have points where we can move things around. Trim the fat, look for opportunities to delete scenes even, because my first rough cut of this film was 2 hours and 28 minutes, and it has to get down to 88 minutes for broadcast and for theatrical.
That's a big difference.
It's huge. And you know, when I first had that rough cut, you're loving the movie because it just looks great, flows great. Gosh, I really don't want to cut that scene, but is it relevant to the story? Do we really need to have that piece of footage in there? Does it make sense? Is it part of the flow? And things like that, I would just start cutting, and I would get it down to what we would call an editor's cut. And then the director would come in. This is like 2 weeks later. The director will then come in and sit with me, and then we start the arm wrestling. And that could be, it's a lot of fun, especially if you're working with a director who you know very well and respect in the business, you know, so it can be a lot of fun. But I won some arguments, and the director won some arguments, but it's all part of the process. We're trying to make the best movie possible, try to get the best story out of what they gave us on stage.
But in pre-production, for months and weeks prior to actually filming, you know, this script, all those pages meant something.
Mm-hmm.
And you film it, and you have over 2 hours of footage, and all of a sudden you've got to trim it down. You would think that that would have been taken care of prior to filming. What's the difference in all of this happening? And there's deleted scenes in movies always, and you know, this is the script, this is what we're going to shoot, but then you have a different version in editing.
Well, even storyboards, you know, you can have everything storyboarded. You can see it on paper in print, and you can see it in storyboards as caricatures. But when you actually get, and even when you get on set and start filming stuff, you start scratching your head. You know, we really don't need this scene. Let's cut it. Scenes have been cut before, you know, just after they start rolling on it. But when you start seeing it all play out on the timeline in the edit suite, things really come into perspective. You know, do we really need that scene? It doesn't make sense. What about moving scene 107 in front of 99? That may help the story flow a little bit better. So you have to be open to things like that. It's all part of the creative process.
How important are the script supervisor's notations when you're editing the film?
Script supervisors are critical. A bad script supervisor can ruin your experience editing. But I was blessed to have a really good script super on this last shoot, and it helps me in the process when I'm doing dailies, because once I set up the dailies and sync up all the audio, then I can go back through and I can look at the notes and say, well, the director liked this take, and this take, so I will label them in the software as best takes, and they change colors, you know, in the software. And then when it comes time to actually do the rough cut or the coverage cut, then I just bring down the best takes and just trash the rest. But I always look at all the footage, because the director will sit down with me and say, well, is that the best take we've got? I said, yeah, that's the best take that you wanted. Well, let's take a look at take two. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't labeled one way or the other. Well, you know, there was a continuity issue, I'll say to the director. And that's why I didn't use that take. And then the director would say, well, let's take a look at it anyway. And we'll take a look at it. And, well, we just wasted 10 minutes. So after a while, the director gets to know the editor and will trust the editor's decision based on the continuity director's or the script supervisor's notes from the shoot.
And speaking of continuity, how can continuity make or break your day in that suite editing these scenes?
Quite a bit.
Those darn actors.
I've pulled so much hair out. I'm surprised I still got any left. A good example, James Hong, a veteran of 400 and some films. He's 82 years old, and every performance that he gives you is different. Every take is different. He'll do something different, mix it. He likes to mix things up. But when he does that, continuity goes out the window because if he's goofing around in a particular scene and picks up a coffee cup with his right hand, and you come around to do the reverse, and we see him holding it in his left hand, that's going to be a serious problem. And so you have to cut around things like that. Some of the best takes were continuity issues, and we couldn't use them. So you have to cut around those kind of things. Some directors like to have the editor do an initial cut, what we call an action cut, just cut for action. You know, wide shot, go to A camera, go to B camera, go back to, back, mix it up, and then come back out. Don't worry about continuity. Well, I always worry about continuity because eventually I'm going to have to come back and fix that. So why not do it right the first time?
And what is the involvement of the director and the producer, or many producers, in the final edit of the film?
Their input is the final say in the matter. There's a little bit of leeway, some give and take, some arm wrestling is how we term it in my edit suite. If the producer and director are one and the same, and even if they're a producer, director, and writer, you only have that one person to go to. In this one feature film I just finished, it was the director and myself, and then we take our director's cut, or actually you should call it the director's editor's cut, and presented it to the producer, and the producer had some more cuts he wanted to make based on what the network wanted to have. We want to see this gone, we want to see this gone, and then the producer has to go to bat for us. We want that scene in there. Without that scene, it doesn't make sense, and we don't know why the network would think that way, but that happens that way. So the producer actually has the final say in that particular instance, but every film's different. The director may be given free license and total control. The producer just pays the bills.
So in general, who wins those editing battles? I guess the higher up you go, that's who wins the edit conflict.
Yeah, with me, I report technically to the director. If the writer wants me to do something or the producer wants me to do something, sorry, I can't do that. I report to the director. I do what the director wants me to do. If there's a director and a separate producer involved and the director's no longer involved in the project because the director delivered the director's cut, they're done. Then it goes to the producer, and then the producer will ask me to make these cuts, and then I will arm wrestle with the producer. And that can be fun.
Now explain your edit process in editing those 30-second commercials way back when, over 3,000.
Yeah.
And now you're focusing on feature films. What is the difference for you?
Right now, commercials pay the bills. The feature film work, when it's available and when you can get it, sometimes is a labor of love or a passion. And then other times it's going to make the rest of your year. Commercials, I approach commercials the same way I approach any kind of a film project. It's a miniature story, and it's a story told in 30 seconds or 60 seconds, even 15 seconds. You have to have a beginning, you have to have a middle, and you have to have an end. Then you, cost-wise, you can't really do storyboards for TV commercials unless it's a bigger budget production. $500,000 for a 30-second commercial will require storyboards. But for local and regional type commercials, usually it's just a script will do. And I try to keep to the script because that's how I'm going to shoot. I'm not going to spend 5-6 hours out in the field shooting footage that I'm only going to end up using 2 or 3 seconds here, 5 or 10 seconds there.
Very good. Coming up next, learn about the tools the editor uses in creating those magical moments on the big screen. We're back in a moment. Back with editor Tim Vogel. Tim, let's talk about sound and sound editing. How do you sync up sound to film or video?
Well, sound is recorded separately nowadays with the advent of new digital technologies. So you need to have a separate sound source. It's going to be better than what comes off the camera. It's funny because we're actually going backwards in film processing. They had separate sound back in the old film days when they were running black and white, or the old Super 35 or even 70 millimeter Panavision film, and they'd have separate audio recording. So that's when they brought out the advent of the sticks, or the slate, clapper, whatever you want to call it. But this little guy right here is, everybody always wants to pick this up when they see it and say, "Oh wow, check this out." Yeah, George, try it. Right? Take two.
I don't know. Does it work?
Take two.
Ah!
You
Anyway,
gotta be careful with that. I hate when that happens.
So the actual sound
Yep.
is how you sync up in the edit room the sound of the
sticks
to the frames of the film or video. How does that work?
Exactly. Well, the camera rolls speed, so the camera's rolling, then sound rolls their speed, and so you have audio and video rolling, and then they stick this up in front of the camera, or whatever camera roll they're on, or in this case now it's a card, and then you have your scene number and your take. And then you just go, scene 44A, take 1, marker. And being 3 cameras, all 3 cameras can be focused on this. This would be called a common marker. And then I can actually sync up all 3 shots from all 3 of these cameras by looking for that little on the waveform on the timeline. It's very distinct. I've had cameras roll for 3 minutes before we actually hear see or hear the slate. And I'm always looking for that peak in the timeline where you get that sound.
A visual peak.
Exactly. It's a visual in audio and visual, because then I'll take in frame by frame as it comes down. Right about here is where you actually hear the sound on the timeline. And I will cut at that point on both the video track and the audio track. And then I line them up. And it's sound synced.
So it's very important for everybody on set to be quiet.
Yes, you have to respect the slate. I've been on shoots where everybody's talking while this is going on and you can't hear it, or somebody's banging something or moving something on set and you hear that, and what take was that? I didn't hear what he said. And I've actually had them have 44 take 4, and actually it's take 8. So you have to hear and see and be very aware of what's going on with this little guy right here. This is critical. And nowadays we have digital time codes. Time code will run free time. It'll be actually the hour of the day, and the minutes, the seconds, and the frame, and as long as it's open. The second you bring it closed, then it goes to the date, and you have sync. So when I've edited a film where we had time code slate, and once the time code goes to the date, that's where I would make my cut and match up the film.
Now, does the editor do other sound editing, music, sound effects?
That is pretty much given over to sound design. That's a whole different department in post-production. But as a film editor these days, you have to have a lot of tools in your toolbox. You have to know After Effects, you have to know motion, other graphics packages, Maya, 3D programs. The more tools you have, you can make that film experience for the director and editing a whole lot better. And it's the same with sound. So we do a little bit of everything in that first pass through of a final edit. We'll put temporary music in, what we call from needle drop or some royalty-free music, something that is in the style with what the director wants for the film. And then it goes to the composer, and then he takes that style and mimics it and comes up with his own piece. But things like sound effects, this last film I did was, I was very heavily involved in looking for sound effects that would help the executives make decisions on certain scenes, like the sound of a bus pulling up at a curbside, doors opening and closing, crowd noises. It just helps in the editorial decision process.
Now, your talents also include producing and directing. You've made short films with your company, Lancer Entertainment. You've also worked on other feature films as well, like we've talked about. You've also worked as a visual effects artist and titles artist. What are those positions?
That's actually how I got started with feature film work. Is you have to start somewhere. That's a good place to start. there was a film, well, Michael Landon Jr.'s The Shining. I was the visual effects artist in that. Basically, you would have a good example of a very simple visual effects process is taking a particular scene. It happens to be a landscape scene with a farmhouse, the barn at night, and they wanted lamplight in the windows. So I took actual lamplight from full-blown scenes and trimmed it out, cut it out, and then I just reduced it down and just laid it in the window, and I put a little diffusion in it or blur it out a little bit because it is way off in the distance, and it looks great. Other effects in that film that I did was I had to paint out 5 sets of wedding rings in a wedding scene, and at the same time there were green screen windows, and it was a motion track shot. So I had 7 tracking markers in this one little scene, and I actually had to frame by frame paint out one particular ring, which was really, really difficult, but that took me a whole day to do that. But again, that's where you have to have Adobe After Effects as a tool. And I hate the program, but it's an amazing piece of software that can do an awful lot.
What makes a good editor?
A good editor needs to be a storyteller first and foremost. They need to be able to have an open mind about things. It's one thing to own Final Cut or Avid Composer or Adobe Premiere. They're all great editing packages, and you can be really good at editing, but to be able to tell a story with what you've got to work with, that's the critical thing. You need to be able to look at a story and say, how can I make that better? You know, it's linear this way, the way it was originally designed. Well, what if we take this piece of the film and move it over here? Does that make sense? You know, that actually is kind of interesting. And you stop and think about it, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, you know, you go back to your previous edit. You keep track of all these different edits at the same time. So you need to be able to take a story and twist it to make it better.
And how can a good editor save a poorly acted or poorly shot film?
I've been there. I'm trying to think. It was a little while ago, but I was given a short film project to edit, and it was a last-minute thing, and it was just the guys showed up with these hard drives. Tim, can you help me? Help me. We need help. And I didn't have a script. I had a basic idea of what the story was, and I had all this footage. I had not even a good rough cut of the film. And I just went through the footage and made it the way I thought it was meant to be made. And it's really tough. It's like taking the eggs out of a baked cake. It's something that I wouldn't recommend doing. It's a tough thing to do. It's a very tough thing to do. I wouldn't even, it would depend on the situation. It really would.
What is your advice for those who want to get into this as a career?
Watch movies, lots of movies, and in particular, not necessarily the old films, because they were pretty much restricted to the way they could cover the film. You know, always on this wide shot, and it might dolly in and then dolly back out. They didn't have the luxury of being able to, go camera to camera to camera to camera to camera. But find a movie that you like and study it. Take a look at how they cut the film. Did they start with a scene wide and went tight, and then come back to wide, go to medium? Just kind of study the way they cut the film. Action films are, that's a whole different animal, because some of your takes or some of your edits are frames, 12 frames here, 10 frames there, whereas a film that's story or more narrative-based, family-friendly, is kind of slower, meandering. You have time to make some nice cuts and some nice transitions.
What do you have coming up next? I've
got 2 films that might happen. We're still kind of in the negotiation process, but The Ultimate Life is the sequel to The Ultimate Gift. That's going to be a union shoot, so I'd have to be a member of the Guild, and at that point I'll be an assistant editor in the Guild, and I will work with a director's hand-picked editor. I'm really hoping that's going to get started here pretty soon. But got a couple other things in the works right now.
I'm very happy with your success, and I look forward to seeing all these great films. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me on, George.
We're back in a moment. Stay with us. That concludes our show. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to contact us with your questions, comments, or show ideas. The email address is belowtheline21@gmail.com, and join our fan page on Facebook. We'll see you next time.
For more information, comments, or questions about the show, email us at belowtheline21@gmail.com.